Hi, everyone. I'm Catherine Herridge in Washington. Thanks for streaming. We begin with breaking news this hour. The U.S. has launched a series of strikes in retaliation for the strike against a base in Jordan that killed 3 U.S. soldiers last weekend. Plans for airstrikes in Syria and Iraq were approved earlier this week. The White House has said it holds Iran responsible for supplying weapons to militant groups who carried out the attacks on U.S. forces. President Biden said Friday, quote, "The United States does not see conflict in the Middle East or anywhere else in the world, but let all those who might do us harm know that if they harm Americans, we will respond." The president and First Lady Jill Biden were present Friday as the 3 fallen U.S. soldiers were returned home. He accompanied the families to the ceremony known as a dignified transfer after meeting with them privately. I'm joined now by CBS News Chief White House correspondent Nancy Cordes and our national security correspondent David Martin, as well as CBS News contributor Sam Vinograd, who also served as an assistant secretary for counterterrorism at the Department of Homeland Security. David, let's start with you. What more are we learning about the strikes that were carried out earlier today?
Well, we know some of the details. There were 85 targets and more than 125 individual munitions dropped on those targets. The planes included a pair of B-1 bombers, which flew all the way from the United States. So this was much, much more than the previous retaliatory strikes we've seen in response to the attacks on American troop locations. To date, I think there have been something like 165 attacks, but it was that one on Sunday which crossed President Biden's red line because 3 Americans were killed. And the next day, he approved the strike we saw unfold tonight. Now, the targets were both the militias that carry out the strikes and the Iranian operatives that work with the militias to arm and train and fund them. And of course, President Biden has said repeatedly that he holds Iran ultimately responsible. We don't know yet what the damage was that these strikes caused. The White House said a short time ago that it looks like they hit everything they aimed at and did considerable damage, if not total destruction, to these targets. But the White House said again tonight, and the Pentagon said again tonight, this is just the beginning, the start of the response. We expect to see at least one more day of airstrikes against targets in Iraq and Syria, and another round of strikes, joint strikes by U.S. and Great Britain against the Houthi targets in Yemen.
Let's bring Nancy Cordes into the conversation. She's at the White House. Nancy, what's the readout from administration officials and whether we're looking at another day of strikes?
They're certainly telegraphing that, Catherine. They said that this is just the beginning of the response, and they've really been signaling for days that this would be what they called a multi-tiered response. So we might see a lot of shock and awe at the beginning, but that we should expect more. A short time ago, we heard from White House officials that they felt, as David said, that these strikes had been successful, but that they are, that they are looking ahead, and that if U.S. service members are injured again, that the president will respond again. You read that quote from the president in a statement saying, if Americans are harmed, then the U.S. will respond. That is a strong statement because we know that U.S. service members have been targeted at least 165 times in Iraq and Syria alone since the Israel-Hamas conflict began in October. So they continue to come under fire. And of course, we saw that deadly incident last Sunday that triggered the planning that we saw over the past few days that culminated in the strikes that we saw today.
Sam, you've been inside the Situation Room in events like this. Take us inside the decision-making and the next steps.
Well, we have to assume that these strikes are part of a larger CONOPS, or concept of operations, in which the president has signed off on a multi-stage set of not just strikes, but other actions against the Iranian regime, to include sanctions, potentially covert action, and diplomatic overtures through third parties. Right now in the Situation Room, I would assume the president is waiting to be briefed on the battlefield assessment of what kind of damage was done, as well as an intelligence assessment of how the Iranian regime is reacting to these strikes. At the same time, his State Department and Department of Defense personnel are likely sharing with him any threats to other U.S. military installations overseas, embassies and consulates, and just overall how force protection or the security of our personnel is looking at this stage. I would also think that Homeland Security professionals from DHS as well as the FBI are briefing on any potential reverberations here in the homeland. As the Iranian regime reacts to these attacks, we have to be cognizant that they could seek to activate operatives all around the world.
I just want to drill down on a point you said about these assessments. It does look like the assessments will be done once we hit the daylight hours. What does that tell us about the human intelligence capabilities on the ground in the region?
Well, I think historically we have had a hard time getting specific and credible intelligence about the Iranian regime, particularly as it pertains to their intentions. As we drew down forces in Iraq, not to mention drew down forces in Afghanistan, we did lose a lot of battlefield intelligence. So our intelligence gathering posture is very different today than it was at the height of the Iraq War or the war in Afghanistan.
So I want to bring David back into the conversation from the Pentagon. David, just walk us through the decision-making leading up to the strikes today.
Well, they began on Sunday with the deadly attack, and I think from then on, a retaliation was just a matter of time and planning. On Monday, before he left on a trip, I believe it was to Florida, President Biden met with his national security advisors, and he came out of that meeting and said that he had decided on his response. And for the rest of the week, I have heard here essentially what the White House said this evening, that the timing was determined from then on by weather. They're waiting for good weather so that the pilots can have eyes on their targets. Having eyes on the targets is not absolutely essential. You can drop GPS-guided bombs, but if you have eyes on your target, you have a safeguard against civilians driving into the target area at the last moment. So this thing was just waiting for the weather from Monday on, and pretty early on, the forecast said that this afternoon, our time, about midnight in Iraq and Syria, would be a good time for the weather to be clear enough to support these kinds of attacks.
Just in the final few seconds, waiting on the weather is one thing, but of course it created this gap which allowed any leadership that was in the region to flee or seek some kind of shelter when these strikes came.
It did. The target list doesn't sound like they even tried to go after some of the leaders. But here's the thing, Catherine. If those leaders want to resume their attacks against American troops, then they're going to have to come out of hiding sometime. And if these strikes tonight and whatever follow-on strikes are conducted are successful, then they're not going to have much to work with when they come out of hiding.
David Martin, Nancy Cordes, and Sam Vinograd, thank you for your analysis and reporting. Since mid-November, there have been more than 30 missile and drone attacks in the Red Sea. They've been carried out by Iran-backed Houthi rebels. Iran has backed groups across the Middle East, including Hezbollah. Debora Patta is in Tel Aviv with an assessment of the threat level.
It is unlikely that Iran will choose to respond directly against the U.S., but one possibility would be through its proxy armed group Hezbollah, based in Lebanon, right on the Israeli border. The Israeli military has been trading fire with Hezbollah fighters since the Hamas attack on October 7th, and increasingly there has been a lot of saber rattling. Israeli troops are on the ready in the north, and Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu has threatened to turn Beirut into Gaza. while Hezbollah's leader, Hassan Nasrallah, has warned that if Israel wages war against them, it will be very costly. Now, Hezbollah has an arsenal of over 150,000 missiles, which, according to Israeli analysts, are 5 times larger and far more accurate than what Hamas uses in Gaza. Catherine?
Debora Patta reporting in Tel Aviv. Mohammed Albasha joins us now. He's a senior Middle East analyst for the Navanti Group. Basha, let's talk about the impact of these strikes. You know the region probably as well as anyone else.
Yeah, I think the strikes tonight were a clear message from the Biden administration to restore deterrence. It was not a surprise. I've been in the talks for a while. But I think tonight, Iran and their militias are finally seeing the consequences and outcomes of killing U.S. soldiers. That's a red line that they crossed.
So let's talk about where the strikes have taken place. It's Iraq and also Syria.
Yes.
How close are the ties between the proxy group in Syria and the leadership in Iran?
Sure. In Iraq, the strikes were in an Anbar area in Al-Qaim. In Syria, it was in Deir ez-Zor. Deir ez-Zor has been an Iranian area of influence and control since the Arab Spring 2011. We saw much influence growing in the area. In 2017 and 18, when Navanti was conducting even research in those areas, we started seeing that Iran started doing the day-to-day affairs of managing those areas to the point where you had IDPs returning to Deir ez-Zor. The Iranian officials were stamping seals of approvals for them to return to the areas. So the areas that they're targeted today were areas that were under Iranian influence for a while and their local militias.
I want to just drill down a little bit more on that, because what you hear from U.S. officials here in Washington is that there's kind of a disconnect between the Iranian leadership and these proxy groups. They may arm them, fund them, supply them, but they really don't have any control over the target set. You're describing a closer relationship.
So that's a closer relationship when it comes to Deir ez-Zor in Syria. I mean, the region is big and every group is different when it comes to their relations with Iran. In Yemen, Ansar Allah, or the Houthis, they call themselves, they are not they're directly controlled by Iran compared to, for example, Hezbollah in Lebanon. Hezbollah in Lebanon receives a direct budget from Iran. In Yemen, the Houthis are not as controlled by Iran, but they do acknowledge that they receive weapon and the transfer of technology and other means of supports from Iran.
We had the advantage of talking a bit before you came on the set, and you said something that really stood out to me. You said that the view in the Middle East is that this is a U.S.-led operation. It doesn't have that feel of a global coalition. For example, the backing of Russia or China, someone who's a very close ally to Iran. Why does that matter?
Yeah, especially in the Red Sea, I think a lot of people are looking for China to play a bigger role, considering a lot of trade that goes through Bab el-Mandeb Strait and the Red Sea is Chinese trade. It's not more an American trade. But this goes back to the question of if the U.S. is not going to be playing the police role in the Middle East, who will be?
So does it require a global coalition to kind of get a lid on the Iranian activity?
Yeah. And the hope is, I mean, it's very hard to tell at this point where the strikes tonight will lead to. Will it lead to maximization of pressure to the point where you're going to de-escalate, or is going to lead to further conflict? So we're at a crossroad. This is uncharted territory that we're seeing tonight.
Mohammed Albasha, thank you for your analysis.
Thank you for hosting us.
A senior Hamas official says the group will respond, quote, very soon to a proposed deal that includes extended ceasefires and hostage releases. Drafted by officials from Israel, the U.S., Qatar, and Egypt, the proposal calls for a 6-week pause in fighting. It also includes the release of Palestinian prisoners being held by Israel at a rate of 3 prisoners per hostage. During that time, significantly more humanitarian aid will be sent to Gaza. As of this month, the Israeli government believes there are more than 100 live hostages being held in Gaza. The country is also seeking the return of 27 bodies for burial.